At 4:30 in the morning, the earth beneath Normandy was already trembling. Not from artillery, not from tanks, from engines. Thousands of them. The men of the German armored reserves believed they understood modern war. Blitzkrieg had crushed Poland. Blitzkrieg had shattered France. Blitzkrieg had torn through the Soviet frontier like a scythe through wheat. Speed, armor, shock. That was the formula. And now, after the landings of June 6, 1944, they were preparing to use it again. They believed they would drive the invaders back into the sea. They believed the beaches were vulnerable. They believed they still controlled the tempo. They were wrong. What they did not see, what they could not stop, was the invisible architecture of American power already tightening around them. Above the hedgerows, beyond the clouds, across the Channel, the United States had assembled something far greater than divisions on sand. It had assembled control of the sky itself. And, in modern warfare, control of the sky is control of destiny. By the time German armored columns began to move toward Normandy, the battlefield had already been rewritten. Rail lines had been torn apart weeks earlier under the Allied transportation plan. Bridges were shattered skeletons. Fuel depots burned in silence. Communication lines flickered and died. Intelligence gathered through ultra-decrypts allowed American planners to anticipate movements before engines even started. This was not reaction. This was orchestration. The U.S. 9th Air Force, operating in seamless coordination with ground commands, did not merely support the invasion. It strangled the response. Fighter bombers patrolled highways like mechanical predators. Thunderbolts descended in disciplined waves, ripping apart convoys before they could form coherent thrusts. Every attempt to mass armor was exposed. Every effort to advance met steel and fire from above. German officers later described the sensation as suffocation. Columns moved at night to avoid detection. It didn't matter. American reconnaissance aircraft had already mapped routes. Interdiction missions were timed with ruthless precision. Fuel trucks exploded. Ammunition carriers vanished in pillars of smoke. Tanks, once symbols of unstoppable force, became isolated hulks trapped in narrow lanes bordered by hedgerows. Blitzkrieg required momentum. Momentum requires movement. Movement requires airspace. And the United States owned it. By June 7th, the Panzer Group West, the Corps Armored Reserve intended to crush the Allied foothold, was already fragmenting under relentless assault. Attempts to concentrate near Caen were met with coordinated airstrikes that disassembled formations before they could engage in meaningful counterattack. Command posts were located and destroyed. Staff officers were killed. Orders failed to reach subordinate units. What was once a spear became scattered fragments of metal across Norman fields. But this was only the beginning, because what unfolded over the next 72 hours would permanently redefine how wars were fought, and prove that American military doctrine had evolved beyond anything the Axis could counter. And what happened next would turn armored warfare itself into a cautionary tale. Germans believed their tanks were the decisive weapon of the war. They had no idea they were driving into a trap designed months in advance. And the most devastating phase was still ahead. The genius of the American response lay not in improvisation, but in preparation. While headlines focused on amphibious landings, the deeper strategy had been set in motion long before the first soldier stepped onto Omaha Beach. The transportation plan, often underestimated in popular memory, was a calculated assault on infrastructure. Rail yards from Paris to the Loire were systematically demolished. Repair crews worked under constant threat of renewed bombing. Each destroyed junction extended German response times by hours, sometimes days. Time in warfare is currency. By June 8th, German armored divisions attempting to reach the front were forced into fragmented, fuel-starved marches. Vehicles arrived piecemeal, often without full ammunition loads. Supply echelons lagged miles behind. The coordination necessary for a decisive counterstrike evaporated under the weight of disruption. Meanwhile, American forces on the ground consolidated positions. Beachheads expanded. Artillery was brought ashore in staggering quantities. Engineers constructed temporary harbors and restored damaged ports with astonishing speed. Logistics, the quiet backbone of victory, flowed with industrial certainty. It was systemic dominance. The United States had harnessed industrial capacity, intelligence analysis, air superiority, naval support, and ground coordination into a single synchronized instrument. Each component amplified the next. When German commanders attempted a concentrated counterattack near Mortain weeks later, they encountered the same pattern. Initial momentum, followed by obliteration from above. Fighter bombers swarmed armored columns trapped on exposed roads. Communications faltered. The psychological impact was profound. Tank crews began to fear clear skies. Officers delayed movements not because of enemy armor, but because of American aircraft. The Luftwaffe, once feared across Europe, could no longer provide consistent cover. Allied air patrols dominated daylight hours. Even limited German air sorties faced overwhelming interception. War had shifted dimensions. The battlefield was no longer horizontal, it was vertical, and the vertical belonged to the United States. The brilliance of this campaign was not just destruction, it was denial. Denial of speed, denial of coordination, denial of surprise. The German doctrine that had shocked Europe in 1939 depended on rapid penetration, supported by air power. Now, stripped of aerial protection and severed from reliable supply chains, armored divisions became slow-moving targets. Every burned tank was more than a tactical loss. It was proof that the balance of innovation had shifted. American planners had understood something essential. Modern conflict would not be won by individual heroics or isolated engagements. It would be decided by integrated systems, intelligence, logistics, and air-ground synergy operating in seamless unison. And Normandy was the demonstration. But even as armored reserves faltered, another challenge loomed, one that would test whether American dominance could be sustained under relentless pressure. Because Germany still had divisions, still had weapons, still had resolve. And the coming days would reveal whether air supremacy alone could guarantee irreversible momentum. Air power had shattered the spear. But could it break the shield? The answer would decide whether D-Day was a foothold or the beginning of the end for Nazi Europe. By June 9 and 10, the pattern was undeniable. Attempts to mount cohesive armored thrusts collapsed under coordinated interdiction. Command nodes were struck with surgical timing. Radio intercepts fed intelligence analysts who predicted concentration points before they fully formed. The American war machine did not chase chaos, it anticipated it. German formations that survived initial bombing often found themselves immobilized by destroyed bridges or blocked rail corridors. Makeshift repairs could not keep pace with systematic destruction. Fuel shortages intensified. Units cannibalized disabled vehicles to keep others operational. Morale deteriorated as crews realized that even successful movement invited immediate aerial reprisal. This was attrition by design, not reckless expenditure, calculated erosion. And above it all, American aircraft maintained relentless presence. Pilots flew multiple sorties daily, guided by forward air controllers embedded with advancing troops. Requests for strikes were transmitted, processed, and executed with efficiency unmatched in earlier phases of the war. Coordination replaced chaos. Precision replaced guesswork. Confidence replaced desperation. By the time German armored reserves were fully committed, they were no longer decisive instruments. They were reactive forces scrambling within a battlefield shaped entirely by American initiative. The landings had not simply survived. They had secured breathing room. And breathing room, under the protective canopy of air supremacy, became expansion. Expansion became breakthrough. Breakthrough would become liberation. But the full magnitude of this transformation and the scale of American strength that made it possible would only become clear as the campaign pushed beyond the beaches. Because the skies over Normandy were not just protecting soldiers, they were announcing a new era of warfare. And in that era, the United States had set the standard. By mid-June 1944, something irreversible had taken shape over France. It wasn't just a beachhead. It wasn't just territory. It was momentum. And momentum, once controlled by Germany's armored doctrine, now belonged entirely to the United States. The German High Command had counted on shock to repel the invasion. They expected hesitation, disorganization, friction between Allied units. Instead, they faced coordination at a scale they had never experienced. Every counterstroke collided with resistance already prepared. Every maneuver encountered disruption before it matured. Every attempt to regain initiative was answered with overwhelming force applied at precisely the right point. The American military did not merely respond, it dictated. On the ground, U.S. infantry divisions pushed through hedgerows that had once seemed impenetrable. Engineers improvised explosive charges to carve openings through earthen embankments. Armor adapted, modifying Sherman tanks with steel prongs to pierce dense bocage. Innovation unfolded in real time. Problems were not obstacles, they were assignments. Above them, the sky remained hostile to German survival. American fighter bombers roamed freely across Normandy and beyond. Supply lines attempting to reconnect shattered formations were systematically hunted. Bridges over the Seine were targeted with relentless accuracy. Rail traffic toward the front diminished to a trickle. Even at night, movement risked detection by flares and patrol aircraft. The German army had prepared for a contest of strength. Instead, it faced a contest of endurance, and endurance favors the side with deeper reserves, stronger logistics, and uncontested airspace. That side was the United States. While German divisions struggled to regroup, American supply chains expanded with industrial precision. Artificial harbors functioned under harsh conditions. Cargo unloaded in staggering volume. Fuel, artillery shells, rations, vehicles, medical supplies. What landed on June 6th was only the beginning. Reinforcements arrived, not sporadically, but in waves. Each day increased the imbalance. By late June, the numerical disparity in aircraft alone told the story. The Luftwaffe could no longer mount sustained operations over the front. Pilots faced immediate interception. Airfields were bombed before squadrons could reorganize. Fuel shortages crippled sortie rates. German ground units operated largely without aerial protection, a catastrophic disadvantage in modern warfare. The battlefield was no longer uncertain, but asymmetry alone does not win campaigns. The decisive question was whether American forces could transform control into breakthrough, and that transformation was coming. Air superiority had secured survival. Now it would enable something far more dangerous: encirclement. And once encirclement begins, collapse follows. As July approached, the Allied command prepared for a concentrated offensive line. The objective was not incremental gain, it was dislocation. Operation Cobra would exploit weeks of attrition inflicted from above and across infrastructure. German units defending the line near St. Lo were already weakened by bombardment and supply disruption. Reserves meant to reinforce them had been mauled en route. When the assault began, it did so under the protective umbrella of American air power. Strategic bombers pounded defensive positions. Fighter bombers struck strongpoints and artillery batteries. The ground shook under coordinated fire that had been meticulously planned. Then the breakthrough came. Once a seam opened, U.S. armored divisions surged through with speed that mirrored and surpassed the very doctrine Germany had once perfected. Patton's Third Army advanced with aggressive tempo, exploiting gaps before they could be sealed. Mobility returned to the battlefield, but under a different flag. German commanders attempted emergency redeployments. They were intercepted. Convoys were strafed. Bridges were destroyed ahead of retreating units. The encirclement at Falaise became the inevitable consequence of weeks of preparation. Trapped forces attempted escape along narrow corridors choked with wreckage. Columns were attacked repeatedly from the air. Vehicles burned across miles of road. Equipment was abandoned. Entire formations disintegrated under pressure applied from multiple axes. What had begun as a counteroffensive weeks earlier had become a catastrophe. The armored spear that once terrorized Europe lay shattered in French fields. And this time, there would be no recovery, because the industrial, logistical, and aerial dominance of the United States did not pause. It accelerated. Yet, even as German forces reeled, one question remained unanswered. Could the momentum sustain itself deep into France? Or would stretched supply lines slow the advance? History would deliver its verdict swiftly. Germany had lost divisions. It had lost mobility. Now it was about to lose something even more critical: the illusion that it could still dictate events. August 1944 unfolded with breathtaking speed. Paris would soon be liberated, but beyond symbolic victories lay a deeper strategic transformation. German forces in Western Europe were no longer maneuvering with purpose. They were reacting in fragments. Command cohesion eroded. Communications faltered. Fuel scarcity intensified. Replacement vehicles could not compensate for the scale of losses. The American military machine, however, adapted continuously. As advances outpaced established supply networks, rapid logistical improvisations emerged. The Red Ball Express was organized to sustain forward momentum with relentless trucking operations. Fuel and ammunition flowed across liberated territory with astonishing urgency. Every mile gained was secured with reinforcement. The contrast was stark. One side improvised from weakness, the other innovated from strength. Air power remained decisive. Interdiction missions extended deeper into retreat corridors. Rail hubs in eastern France and western Germany were struck repeatedly. The Luftwaffe, diminished and fragmented, could not contest dominance. Allied aircraft operated with confidence that bordered on inevitability. German troops withdrawing toward the frontier faced constant harassment. Movement during daylight became perilous. Equipment shortages compounded exhaustion. Morale deteriorated as soldiers recognized that operational initiative had vanished. This was not a gradual decline, it was systemic unraveling. And at its core was a lesson written in fire over Normandy. The United States had mastered it. Intelligence predicted movement. Air power disrupted concentration. Logistics sustained advance. Ground forces exploited openings. Each element reinforced the others in continuous cycle. By September, the German army in the West had been forced into defensive posture along its own borders. What began as a desperate attempt to repel a landing had ended in strategic retreat across hundreds of miles. The cost was immense. The outcome was irreversible. Yet even then, some in Berlin clung to the belief that one final counterstroke could reverse fortunes. They would attempt it in the Ardennes months later. But the conditions that had doomed their response in Normandy had not disappeared. They had multiplied, and the American advantage had only grown stronger. What Germany faced in late 1944 was not simply an opposing army. It faced a nation whose industrial strength, tactical innovation, and air dominance had fused into an unstoppable force. And once unleashed, that force did not retreat. The Normandy campaign was more than a successful invasion. It was proof of concept. It demonstrated that the United States had transcended traditional notions of battlefield power. Victory did not hinge solely on bravery, though bravery was abundant. It depended on coordination across domains: land, sea, air, intelligence, and industry operating in unified purpose. When German armor rolled toward the beaches, it carried confidence born from years of conquest. When American aircraft rose to meet it, they carried something greater: preparation, adaptation, overwhelming capacity. The skies above France did not merely witness battle, they declared supremacy, and from that supremacy flowed liberation, momentum, and eventual victory across Western Europe. The armored spear that once dominated continents had been neutralized not by chance, not by luck, but by deliberate design executed with relentless discipline. In Normandy, the United States did more than hold ground. It redefined the balance of modern war, and from that moment forward, the outcome was no longer a question of possibility. It was only a matter of time.